Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford of the Rocky Mountains. In this video, a remake of one of the oldest videos that had still remained up on my channel, I'm just going to tell you a little bit of the basic facts about myself with some links to some other videos that explain more, and particularly I'm going to cover the question that I get asked all the time, which is how did you get interested in the stuff you got a PhD in and professionally teach and talk about on YouTube, which is Norse language and myth. Well, to begin with, if we start from the beginning, as you can read on my Wikipedia page that someone wrote, I was born in Houston, Texas, to a family that actually has moved around my entire life, but has remained anchored principally in Colorado. And by the time I was 10, I had moved with my parents back to the area around Black Hawk, Central City, Colorado. And that's also where my paternal grandparents live. And over the ensuing years, I came to identify very closely with them and to love them very deeply and to take after them in as many ways as I possibly could, following a fairly different professional path. The interest in Old Norse and such arose in a sort of roundabout way. I have no Scandinavian family or family connections. I mean, people can speculate about what could be way back there, but I've never really cared. That's never been what it's about. At any rate, my last name's not Anderson, and there's no tradition of my family moving from Scandinavia. We're Scotch-Irish, from somewhere in Scotland originally. Who knows? Actually, a good friend in Scotland has been working on some evidence for specifically where my Crawford line might be from, so that's kind of interesting, but you know, beside the point. Basically what happened is I was a huge dinosaur kid, and that was partly the fault of my father and his side of the family, because my mother and her side of the family were very creationist, right? I mean, all families have their disagreements. My father's side wasn't of fundamentalist beliefs. And so dinosaurs were the sort of stealth interest that one side of my family created in me in order that I would, on my own, discover some alternative ways of looking at the world. I've always thought that was funny since I found out about it. But I love dinosaurs, and in fact, I wanted to be a paleontologist for most of my life, and I guess that's still true even at this age. I really love dinosaurs. I still do. I stay up with all the dinosaur news and such. One of my best friends, Matt Mossbrucker, actually did go on to become a paleontologist, now runs the Morse Natural History Museum in Morse, Colorado. So, you know, he followed that dream. But what happened to me is, like I said, we moved around quite a bit. By the time I was in middle school, I went to one middle school in 7th grade that had a choice of languages you could do, and I chose Latin. Kind of unusual for middle school and in the late 20th century maybe. But I took Latin, and the reason that I did was because the dinosaur names were in Latin. I had developed a pretty decent, you know, I thought Latin and Greek vocabulary from learning all these dinosaur names, but I wanted to learn more. But what was interesting is I actually had become very, very taken with the idea of evolution from studying dinosaurs and birds, because I was really into birds, I still am. And so I thought, oh, how interesting it is to look at dinosaurs, this older thing, and birds, this thing we see all around us, and they don't necessarily immediately look like they're all that similar, but in fact are extremely closely related. And I noticed that was the same thing with Latin, right? I realized that the Spanish that I heard all around me, and also many other languages, were directly derived from Latin, and that English itself had had a long and interesting history that did not trace back to Latin, but of course had a path that had intersected with Latin several times, kind of wound around it, or they'd wound around each other. So I became interested in historical linguistics at the ripe old age of whatever that was, right? I guess I was 11 or 12. It was not my dominant interest at that time, but it quickly grew to be till at some point in high school I decided that was what I wanted to do, was old languages. which was a little bit of a ridiculous ambition and hasn't gotten less ridiculous maybe. I'm holding up the phone just in case. The wind is blowing pretty hard. So, all right. Anyway, basically what happened is, I studied Latin, then I studied Old English because I was interested in the ancestral form of English. And I got more and more interested in other languages that were connected to English in ancient ways. And so it was fairly natural that I became interested in the Old Norse language, which I began to teach myself in 2003 after Brent Vine, an Indo-European scholar at UCLA, who I was communicating with in high school and college, because it's just the kind of nerd I was, recommended that I try teaching myself with Gordon's Introduction to Old Norse, and that's exactly what I did. I really enjoyed it. I thought, what was great about it was that it was a forgotten sister of English, right? This was a language that's actually very closely related to English, but it got its own way. And one of the best things about it was that the literature was so interesting. In a lot of ancient languages, you're not necessarily going to be able to read anything that's all that engrossing. Gothic is an interesting language, another forgotten sister or maybe forgotten aunt to English. But, all you can read is the Bible, and I'd read the Bible in English, right? That wasn't necessarily all that interesting. But in Old Norse, there's lots of fascinating stuff to read. There's the Eddas, the Poetic Edda, and the Prose Edda, and there's many, many interesting sagas. So I got really taken with that, particularly because in a completely different class in middle school, I had become fascinated with the poem in the Poetic Edda called Havamal. I had read Edith Hamilton's mythology in this class called Adolescent Literature, which was basically just 1 hour of the teacher telling you what to read based on what she thought was your destiny, sort of, and she thought that my interest in languages was somehow fateful, so she got me reading all this stuff about the ancient world and ancient languages and ancient literature. So I read Edith Hamilton's mythology, which is mostly about Greco-Roman mythology, but has a short section at the end about Norse myth. And it quotes from Havamal. I don't remember if Edith Hamilton actually acknowledged that the work she was quoting was Havamal. She just, I think, called them Proverbs of Odin, but I can't remember now. I actually haven't looked back at that book in a long time. And the advice that I saw in these Proverbs of Odin and Havamal was so similar to the advice of the person I revered most in the world, my grandfather in Colorado, that I was really taken with it. It was almost like this code of the West that Papa, what I call my grandfather, had always talked about, but never spoken, never delineated, never actually given codified form, was there, codified in a manuscript written down in Iceland 800 years ago, based on an oral tradition that's probably 1100 years old. So that text really fascinated me. I really loved it. I began memorizing large parts of it in Old Norse as an undergraduate. I wasn't necessarily sold on focusing on Scandinavian yet, though. I also had a lot of interest in older Indo-European traditions. So for my undergrad, I actually majored in classics and Latin and Greek. I took a lot of classes in Old English, which of course remained a strong interest of mine and still does. Then for my master's degree, I went to the University of Georgia and I studied with the fantastic Jared Klein. Wonderful man, wonderful professor, one of the most knowledgeable people I've met in my life, perhaps the most knowledgeable. He taught me, and so did some of the other professors working with him, more ancient languages of the Indo-European family. I studied Sanskrit, including Vedic Sanskrit. I studied Old Armenian, Old Church Slavic. I studied Gothic, Old Irish, if I didn't mention that already, Hittite, and of course Proto-Indo-European itself, which is reconstructed with a fairly high degree of confidence by linguists and can be sort of studied, not so much for reading it because there's nothing to read, it's an unattested lost language, but for understanding the larger family and the way that it's developed. And so for my master's thesis, I decided, with Dr. Klein's recommendation, basically he said that the way to try to get a job, when your thing is old languages, is to be really good at one of those old languages and to find yourself in a department that includes that language. So you might be a Latinist, you might specialize in Greek. For me, I mean, the language that really sang to me, as it were, was Old Norse, so that's what I decided to focus on. So my master's thesis focused on the transition from Old Norse to modern Icelandic in the way that demonstrative determiners are used. So I remain very interested in these evolutionary questions, right? These transitions from one stage to another. That remains a fixation of mine. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where my PhD was in Scandinavian studies, focusing on philology. Philology and historical linguistics are sometimes considered basically synonyms, but they're really not. Historical linguistics, you're using texts to get at language. In philology, it's more like you're using language to get at the text. So both types of scholars know the languages and the text very well, but it's sort of a question of which one they're using to get at the other fundamentally, if that makes sense. I think that's a fairly fair way of putting it. And then my PhD dissertation there was on the historical development of basic color terms in Old Norse. So I looked at the way that the color wheel, in other words, was categorized in Old Norse, and how that had changed over time. Again, reflecting my interest in the evolution of things, which is also, of course, reflected in my interest in mythology. I talk often on my channel about how Norse myth isn't a static picture, but something that changed over time, just as any system of beliefs does and has, including Christianity. So then my working life, I taught at UCLA as full-time instructional faculty in the Scandinavian program, teaching Old Norse language, history of the Scandinavian languages, all-time favorite class to teach. There's that win. Icelandic sagas, Norse myth, etc. I also taught Norwegian language there. That was 3 years, 2011 to 14. Then I was out of academia for 2014 to 15. Then 2015 to 17, I taught at the University of California, Berkeley. That was, I taught the modern Icelandic language. I also taught Norse myth there and sagas. And I had planned a history of the Scandinavian languages class for Berkeley, but that never panned out. And now, since 2017, I have, by complete coincidence, been back in Colorado, back home. It's been really wonderful to be close to, you know, close to the earth that I've always stood in awe of, and close to the spirit of my grandfather, I like to think. And so that's been great. And here at the University of Colorado Boulder, I direct the program in Nordic Studies, which is a subdivision of the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures. And I teach, so far, mostly classes in Norse myth and Icelandic sagas. And these are huge classes. I'm actually required to teach a class of 150 or more every semester, and these classes never have trouble filling up. In fact, the wait list is often that long. People are fascinated by this stuff, and even though those are undergrad classes that people are often taking just to fulfill a credit, I would say that the level of interest is pretty high, not always in the really big classes, which are more for people, again, that are just taking it for a credit, but interest levels are often high, and mostly these are very enjoyable classes to teach. So I've also, I've stopped cutting these moments where I struggle with the camera because people have questioned whether I actually go to these places or if I'm using a blue screen. I don't know how to use a blue screen or where to find a blue screen. This is real, this is where I am, it's where I live, it's where I spend my time. I am on the internet only when I have to be, because it's certainly not out here. All right, what was I saying? Yeah, so I've also worked as a translator. So when I was teaching at UCLA, of course, this is the first time I was teaching Norse myth classes, and I assigned a translation of the Poetic Edda that was quite scholarly and in-depth, but that was very hard for my students to read, even though it was a recent translation. It wasn't one of these early mid-20th century translations that people get hung up on the internet. It was a well-done recent scholarly translation by a great friend and respected scholar, Carolyn Larrington. But the students still found it hard to read, primarily because the word order was left sort of relatively unmodified from Old Norse. Now, when you read a lot of poetry, including just in English, you can get used to the way that that word order can be pretty variable. And in a language like Old Norse, it's extremely variable. But if you don't read a lot of poetry, and most people today don't, and especially if you're not familiar with other languages, that change in word order makes it very hard to follow a story, and these are extremely entertaining stories. I also thought that most translators, including the most recent ones, use too much archaic vocabulary in spite of leaving behind the these and thous and lovest and loveths of early and mid-20th century translators, which I think it's execrable to write for an audience. It's all dead, but that's me. So I decided to make my own translations into a contemporary modern English that also reflected current scholarship. And then I hadn't actually translated the entire thing by 2012, early 2012 sometime, when I contacted Hackett Publishing Company soon after I had written a review of their translation of Beowulf by Dick Ringler at the University of Wisconsin. Incidentally, someone I'd virtually never encountered at the University of Wisconsin except to say hello to. And I said, well, so Hackett, you're an ancient books publisher, you're well known for your Greek and Latin stuff. How about expanding your medieval line beyond Beowulf? How about some Old Norse? And I pitched the Poetic Edda at them, and editorial director Brian Rack was interested, asked me when I could have a sample ready, and I said, I do have a sample. I've already done 6 of these poems for my Norse myth class so that they can appreciate these in a natural sounding translation. I sent those to Hackett. Hackett got interested, and by, what was it? It was March 2015, I suppose, my translation of the Poetic Edda, Stories of the Norse Gods and Heroes, was published by Hackett. In 2017, that was followed by my translation of the Saga of the Volsungs, with the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. And then in fall 2018, I recorded the audiobooks for both of those at Coop Studios in Boulder, Colorado. That was a really neat experience. And I will also be translating. I've already signed contracts for, and I'm almost done with my 3rd book of translations, the Saga of Hervor and Hedrick, with the Saga of Rolf Kraki. That will be followed by the already signed and contracted translation of the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. And Hackett is also very interested in a textbook in Old Norse eventually, so that'll be fun to do. But that's obviously distant future at this point. And no contract's been signed. And by the way, Edda fans, there's a special something that may well come out later in 2019 between, or before the Saga of Hervor and Hedrick and the Saga of Rolf Kraki. I can't speak of it yet, though. I've also done some TV and film consulting. I consulted on Disney's Frozen. I have consulted on various other television shows. The main one that I'm thinking of, I still can't talk about in January 2019, but you'll find out what I'm talking about fairly soon, and I'll talk about it on the channel when it's out. And I, of course, started my YouTube channel in 2016. I began, basically what my idea was to begin with was I had read that making free content was a great way to drive people to your paid content. So, of course, the paid content I was looking to drive traffic to was my translations, the Poetic Edda, and what was then the soon-to-be released Saga of the Volsungs. But eventually I learned also about Patreon and how you could just have people throw a couple bucks in the can every month to help you support that free content. And so I started a Patreon, and I was amazed at the response I got. Of course, it didn't take off right away, but by now, in January 2019, it's actually my main source of income. I have almost 1,000 Patreon supporters right now, and I couldn't be more thankful. It's completely changed my life to be able to pay my bills, right? Because that was a big reason why I started Patreon, and was trying to drive more traffic to my books while I was still teaching at Berkeley in 2016. Berkeley didn't pay me enough to pay my bills, right? I mean, I was really, really struggling and having a hard time finding a second job. So that's a little bit about the course that's led me to here. My video skills, I think, have continued to improve. That's one reason why I remake videos, in addition to the fact that I just like having these mountain backgrounds and not the backgrounds of my office at Berkeley. And I also get sick of people thinking I still teach at Berkeley. Not so much for the associations with Berkeley. You know, people always associate Berkeley just with politics. It's a great school, fantastic students. But, you know, also, people have made donations to my old department at Berkeley thinking that I'm still there, and I can't live with that. So I've got to slowly remake the videos from back then that say, I teach at Berkeley, I don't anymore. Yeah, well, I hope this has encouraged you maybe to check out more of my videos, or perhaps given you more of an appreciation of how I got where I am and how these videos have all come to be. And I hope also whetted your appetite to check out the books if you haven't yet. And, well, for now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.